September 22nd, 2023. A little after midday, Sevastopol on the southern tip of occupied Crimea, the oldest naval fortress on the Black Sea, and the home of the Russian fleet since before the United States had a navy of its own. Inside a headquarters building on Lazarevska Street, senior officers of the Black Sea Fleet were gathering for a meeting. Above them was airspace that Russia considered the most heavily defended in the world outside of Moscow itself. Below them, in the same harbour, the wreckage of a submarine and a landing ship still smouldered from 9 days before. They did not hear it coming. That is the point. Days earlier, the commander of the Ukrainian Air Force, Lieutenant General Mykola Oleshchuk, had answered the world's curiosity with a single, almost casual sentence. The British Storm Shadow, he wrote, they hung under the left wing of the Su-24M, the French one, the Scalp, under the right. 2 Western missiles, 1 Soviet bomber, and a target more than 200 kilometres behind what Russia believed was an impassable wall of air defence. The weapon that reached that headquarters was not fast. It was not new. It was designed in the 1990s and it flew slower than a passenger jet. It crossed the coastline low, following the shape of the ground, a flat grey dart beneath an aircraft older than most of the men who flew it. And it arrived exactly where Russia's admirals had told themselves nothing could arrive. For days afterward, Moscow's air defence officers would insist that almost everything had been shot down. The crews who flew the mission knew the weapon's name. The Russians, standing in the ruins of their own command room, could not explain how it had gotten through. This is the story of how a missile Britain had been quietly keeping in reserve, placed in Ukrainian hands, broke the myth that Crimea was untouchable. And it begins with why that myth was, for a very long time, entirely reasonable. Here is the truth the Ukrainians had to defeat. The Russian model was not foolish. It was built on decades of doctrine, and on its own terms it made complete sense. Start with the ground. When Russia seized Crimea in 2014, it turned the peninsula into one of the densest air defence networks on the planet, layer upon layer. At the top sat the S-400, a long-range system designed to see aircraft and missiles hundreds of kilometres away and kill them at the edge of the horizon. Beneath it, the older S-300 filled the medium band, and wrapped close around the high-value bases sat the Pantsir S-1 and the Tor short-range systems whose entire job was to catch the low, fast things that slipped under everything else. On paper, it was seamless. The long reach of the S-400 was supposed to be protected by the short reach of the Pantsir, so that nothing could get close by flying high, and nothing could get close by flying low. That was the theory. It was a good theory. Now add geography. Sevastopol sat deep inside occupied territory, far from the front line behind that wall. Russian planners treated the peninsula as a rear area, a sanctuary, a place where the fleet could rest and repair in safety. For a year and a half of full-scale war, that assumption held. The fleet fired its Caliber cruise missiles at Ukrainian cities from these very waters and sailed home to these very docks. It had done so since before this war, and before the last one. 2 centuries of habit told Moscow that Sevastopol could not be reached, and the confidence was public. After nearly every Ukrainian attempt, the Russian Ministry of Defense would announce that its air defences had intercepted almost everything, that a little debris had fallen, that the situation was in hand. To a Russian officer reading those bulletins, the picture was clear. The umbrella worked. The fortress held. Understand this clearly, because the whole story turns on it. Russia was not beaten by a system that was obviously stupid. It was beaten inside a system that was, by the standards of the last 30 years, genuinely formidable. The S-400 is a serious weapon. The men who operated it were trained professionals. The doctrine that placed it over Crimea was sound. The model was rational. The terms were what failed. Because every layer of that defence had been built to answer a certain kind of threat, arriving a certain way, at a certain speed and height. It held against exactly that. And then, in the summer of 2023, something arrived that had been designed, 3 decades earlier, to answer a different question entirely. The weapon was called Storm Shadow. And to understand why it worked, you have to stop thinking about speed and start thinking about height. Storm Shadow is an air-launched cruise missile, built by the European group MBDA, in service with the Royal Air Force since around 2002. It is subsonic. It cruises at roughly Mach 0.8, slower than the fighters Russia scrambled to find it. On its own, that sounds like a weakness. It is not, because the missile was never trying to outrun anything. It was trying to stay out of sight. It does that by flying low, very low. It hugs the terrain, following the rise and fall of the ground using a stored map of the landscape, so that it hides in the clutter beneath the radar horizon, the exact band the S-400 was least able to watch. A radar on a mast can only see so far over the curve of the Earth. Fly under that line, and the most powerful long-range system in the Russian arsenal is looking straight over your head. Then there is the matter of finding the target. Storm Shadow navigates by inertial guidance and satellite fix on the way in, but in its final dive it opens an imaging infrared seeker, a small camera in the nose that compares what it sees to a picture loaded before launch. That matters, because it does not depend on satellite signals at the end. Russia jams those signals constantly. The missile does not care. It looks at the building, matches the shape, and strikes within a few meters. Against a fixed target that has not moved in years, a few meters means a near certain hit. And then there is the warhead. This is the part that reaches command rooms. Storm Shadow carries a two-stage charge called BROACH. The first stage blows a hole in the outer surface, a roof, a bunker wall, a ship's hull. The second stage flies through that hole and detonates inside. It does not blast a target from the outside. It goes in first, and then it explodes. Put those four things together, and you have the answer to the mystery in the title. Not fast, but too low to see. Not stealthy, but immune to jamming. Not new, but carrying a warhead built to punch through and detonate within. It was never a duel of speed. It was a weapon designed, in a British laboratory in the 1990s, to defeat exactly the kind of defence Russia had spent a decade building over Crimea. But a missile is only as good as the aircraft that carries it, and here Ukraine did something no one expected. It hung this NATO weapon under the wing of a Soviet ghost. The Su-24M, an aging swing-wing bomber first flown in the 1970s, was rebuilt to speak to a Western missile. It was the first time Storm Shadow had ever flown on an aircraft that was not from a NATO nation. The work fell to one unit, the 7th Tactical Aviation Brigade, flying from Starokostiantynivka in western Ukraine, threading their old jets low across the country to a launch line only they could reach. What that brigade did next, over Sevastopol, would change how NATO air forces looked at their own aging stockpiles. But before the combat record, one small thing. If this deep dive into British engineering is holding your attention, take a second and subscribe. It costs nothing, and it helps the channel reach more people who care about how these weapons actually work. Now, the harbour. The first blow landed in the dark, overnight into September 13. Ukrainian crews sent a wave of cruise missiles into the ship repair yard at Sevastopol. Russia said it shot most of them down. It admitted in the same breath that at least 3 got through. Inside the dry dock, 2 warships were under repair. One was the landing ship Minsk. The other was a Kilo-class attack submarine, the Rostov-on-Don, a boat that had itself fired Caliber missiles into Ukraine. When the smoke cleared, the landing ship was gone, assessed by open-source trackers as destroyed, and the submarine had 2 great holes torn in its hull, blown open from the inside by that 2-stage warhead. It was the first submarine the Russian Navy had lost to enemy action since the Second World War. Even Moscow's own war bloggers admitted it. Rybar, the largest of them, conceded that 3 Storm Shadows had reached their targets, that both vessels were badly hit, and warned that the raids would go on. So how did Britain come to hold a weapon like this, and what did it cost to give it away? Here is what the number really means. Storm Shadow was not improvised. It was the product of decades of British and French precision strike engineering, refined through the merger of Europe's missile makers into a single group, proven in the Iraq War of 2003 and used again over Libya and over Syria. By the time it reached Ukraine, it was a mature, combat-tested deep strike weapon, the kind of capability only a handful of nations on Earth can build, and even fewer will part with. And now the figure the entire argument rests on. In its full version, Storm Shadow reaches beyond 500 kilometers. That single number is the whole story. It meant that from airspace Ukraine still controlled, a Ukrainian crew could hold at risk every port, every airfield, every headquarters across the entire occupied peninsula. Sevastopol was no longer deep. Sevastopol was no longer safe. The wall Russia had built was tall, but this flew around the end of it. Consider the irony buried in that reach. Russia's own Caliber cruise missiles fly several times farther, perhaps 7 times the range of the British weapon. On distance alone, Moscow held the advantage the entire war, and it did not matter. The contest was never distance. It was the quiet assumption that the rear was safe, and that assumption is the thing British reach quietly deleted. Now the harder part of the story, what Britain gave up. Storm Shadow is not something a country owns in unlimited supply. When Russia launched its full invasion, the United Kingdom held only around 600 of these missiles in its entire inventory. They are not cheap, roughly £2 million each, and they cannot be conjured quickly. Every one sent to Ukraine was one subtracted from Britain's own war stocks, from the capability the Royal Air Force keeps for its own defence, and Britain went first. Before any ally, it was the United Kingdom that broke the taboo and handed Ukraine true long-range strike in May of 2023, knowing Moscow would call it escalation. The Defence Secretary of the day, Ben Wallace, stood in Parliament and confirmed the gift in careful, deliberate language, stressing its limits even as he announced it. France followed weeks later with its own Scalp missiles, the identical weapon under a different name, which is why the officer who flew the mission could speak of one under each wing. Analysts who track these things warned that the stockpile was small and that Ukraine would have to spend it with great care. Britain has since committed close to £1 billion to rebuild the stocks of equipment it gave away. That is the sacrifice this story is really about, not a line in a budget, a finite national arsenal drawn down so that Ukrainian crews could reach the fleet that was shelling their cities. And it is precisely the thing Russia cannot answer in kind. Not because the idea is secret, but because the capability is the product of an entire industrial and institutional order that sanctions and isolation have placed beyond Moscow's reach. The precision seeker, the fire control, the miniaturized guidance, all of it depends on a web of Western microelectronics Russia can no longer freely buy. And the deeper wound was structural in another way entirely. When that submarine was crippled in the dry dock, Russia could not properly fix it. The only yards that could were on the far side of the Bosphorus, a strait closed to the warships of a nation at war under a treaty nearly a century old. The Black Sea had become a trap. Whatever was broken there stayed broken there. Russia, of course, adapted. It always does. To pretend otherwise would be to make the same mistake Moscow made about Ukraine. After the first strikes, Russian air defence crews began claiming interceptions with growing confidence. On the night the shipyard burned, they said they had downed 7 of 10 missiles. When the next blow came, they would say they stopped 5 of 6. And some of those claims were surely true. Storm Shadow is not invulnerable. The Russian High Command shifted its electronic warfare, moved its defences, and learned the missile's signature. Over time, some were jammed off course, and some were shot down. But look at what the successful claims actually concede. 7 of 10 still means 3 got through. 5 of 6 still means 1 arrived, and against a target like a headquarters or a submarine, 1 is enough. The arithmetic of air defence is merciless that way. The defender has to be right every single time. The missile only has to be right once, which brings us to the second blow and to the moment that gives this story its name. On September 22nd, the same brigade sent Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles at the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet itself, timed, Ukrainian intelligence later said, to strike while the fleet's senior officers were meeting inside. Local Russian officials claimed 6 missiles were fired and 5 intercepted, and then came the fact that undid the claim. 1 hit. That one punched through the roof and detonated within, exactly as the warhead was built to do. The headquarters of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, in the heart of a peninsula Moscow had called a fortress, was gutted from within. The building was later torn down. Footage from Crimea in the month that followed showed just how thin the umbrella had become. In one clip, a pair of Storm Shadows flew serenely over an S-400 battery on their way to a Russian airfield, unengaged, untouched. In another, a Pantsir tried and failed to stop them at close range. The Turkish analyst Can Kasapolu put it plainly. The S-400, he argued, was supposed to be shielded by shorter-range systems against exactly these low-flying threats, and the architecture had severe gaps that Ukraine was successfully exploiting. The most advanced air defence Russia owned was being flown past. Here Russia was right about one thing and catastrophically wrong about another. It was right that its own missiles outranged the British one, right that on a chart of pure numbers it held the longer arm. It was wrong about the only thing that mattered. The length of your reach means nothing if you have assumed the enemy cannot reach you at all. And then there was the fog, the part the Admirals truly could not explain. Ukraine's Special Operations Forces claimed the headquarters strike had killed dozens, up to 34 officers, they said, including senior leadership and even the fleet's commander, Admiral Viktor Sokolov. Within a day, Ukraine's own military intelligence chief, Kirilo Budanov, gave a far more cautious figure, at least 9 killed, and pointedly declined to confirm the admiral's fate. Russia said almost nothing had happened, 1 serviceman missing, and then, days later, Russian state television released video appearing to show Admiral Sokolov alive and at a meeting, and independent analysts who ran the footage through facial recognition concluded it was indeed him. Ukraine then said it was clarifying its information. So hold the 2 facts that are certain and let go of the ones that are not. The human toll of that room may never be settled, and this story will not pretend to settle it. But the building was destroyed. That is not in dispute. The command room of the Black Sea Fleet had been reached, and Russia's own account of who was and was not inside it dissolved into contradiction, which is its own kind of confession. None of this came free to Ukraine, and honesty demands the ledger. The Su-24 is old, and there are few of them, flown at terrible risk by a small pool of crews. The missiles themselves are scarce, rationed for only the highest value targets. Russia's defences did improve, and the political leash was real, the weapon restricted at first to targets inside Ukraine's own territory, which included occupied Crimea, but not Russia proper. The men who flew these missions knew the cost better than anyone. One Su-24 pilot of the brigade, identified only as Victor for his safety, described it to a Ukrainian outlet the following year. The crews, he said, signed up in a queue for the honour of these missions. When it was time to fly, no one asked why me. They asked, may I? Sometimes, he said, a second and a half was worth a life. So return to Sevastopol, and to that September, and to the officer who described the 2 missiles hung beneath the wings of an old bomber. Set the 2 records side by side the way this story began. Russia had the denser air defence, the longer-range missiles, the 2-century fortress, and the settled belief that its rear was safe. Ukraine had an ageing Soviet jet, a small handful of borrowed British missiles, and one idea Russia had failed to imagine, that the wall could be flown around instead of through. What that reach finally meant is written in the harbour it emptied. In the weeks after these strikes, the Black Sea Fleet began abandoning the base it had held for more than 200 years, pulling its ships east to Novorossiysk, out from under the shadow of missiles it could not reliably stop. Britain's own defence ministry would later judge the fleet functionally inactive. The fortress had not fallen to an invasion. It had been made untenable by a weapon Britain very nearly kept on a shelf. Be honest about the limits, because this channel does not deal in victory laps. Storm Shadow could not do everything. It struck fixed targets, not moving armies. The stockpile was always small. The Su-24 that carried it grew fewer with every loss. Russia adapted, jammed, and shot some down, and the leash on where the missiles could fly was real. This was not a wonder weapon. It was a scalpel, and Ukraine used it as one. But think about what a scalpel in the right hand can do. It found the single assumption the fortress rested on, and it cut that assumption out. It turned the safest water in Russia's war into the most dangerous. And it did so in the hands of crews who lined up for the privilege of the mission, who asked to be sent rather than spared, for whom the smallest margin of time was the difference between coming home and not. Remember them. The pilots of the 7th Brigade flying a Cold War ghost low across their own country to a launch line at the edge of the possible. The engineers, a generation gone, in Britain and in France, who built a weapon in the 1990s precise enough to matter 30 years later. And the nation that handed away a piece of its own arsenal, first among all its allies, so that those crews could reach the fleet that was shelling their homes. Russia's admirals never did explain how the missile reached their command room. The men who flew it never needed to. They already knew. In the next chapter, we follow another donated weapon into this same war and another blind spot it was built to find. Subscribe and stay with us for it.